This is the last week of Patrick Lecture 6, The Human Role in the Spiritual and Material Universes. There were a great number of questions and answers in this lecture, and so I had the room to include many of them. So this week for subtopic is a bunch of miscellaneous stuff. I find the original lectures, the early lectures of great interest because it tells me there's more going on than honestly I wish to investigate. So it clues me in that there's a bigger heavenly bureaucracy, that there are more details than I may be privy to, that things I don't believe may be true, and things I believe may not be true. And it encourages me, or I have learned to be encouraged, to suspend my beliefs, because after all, how would I personally know? I can feel into an answer and sense that there is truth in it. But to know it is true would mean that I would need to have a personal conscious experience of the world of spirit. And over again, the guide explains, oh, no, you don't get that. Part of the price for the incarnatory journey is amnesia. You're not allowed to know all the answers and just act out accordingly. This is meant to be a bit of a blind groping process because, and this is where I want to differentiate the how from the why. The discussion of metaphysics, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, how many archangels they are, how they're related to Christ, to God, to Lucifer. This is more how than why. And it has interest, as I said, but it can distract from the why. And the why is central to pathwork for me. The how is interesting, the why is absolutely central. I tend to explain things with a lot of metaphors, so I'm going to do that here because, after all, I don't know what the spirit world is like, so I can't explain it to you, and I can't defend it. And I choose not to debate it in an academic or intellectual sense. I'm a little bit more practical minded than that. It's a good thing to do for its own purpose, not my thing. So, metaphors. The guide, number one, explains things many times. If you have a pet peeve or a pet interest, I invite you to go to the Pathwork Lecture Word Search website. The link is listed on my website. And or do your own Google search if you know how to operate your own computer and you have all the lectures and Q&As on your computer. To do a search based on a specific word and or phrase, and gather up all the, and I want to stress paragraphs. I know some of them are very long, but as best you can, paragraphs rather than phrases or sentences, about how the guide explains something. Why? Because there are 258 lectures and 115, give or take, additional questions and answer lectures. So let's use the figure of 400. There are 400 documents, manuscripts, and offhand, I'd say that the guide explains the same thing 1,200 times, 3 times as often as there are actual lectures, more than once. And when he re-explains something or goes through it again, it's as if he goes through it from a different angle, a different perspective, given different circumstances, to shine light on different aspects of what he's trying to communicate. Basically, words are limited. He says that over and over again. And our understanding of words is based upon our interpretation of words. So it's an imprecise medium to try to communicate very complex, energetic, and spiritual concepts. often when someone says, but the guide said this, he said a lot of things, and he said it in many different ways. And they don't always sound the same in the beginning. He doesn't use the same opening 4 words or 6 words every time he explains something. So finding out what the guide is actually trying to say can require reading many lectures, which involves time. It's not an academic process. It requires time because you have to notice and look at and absorb and feel the differences between different explanations. So, metaphors for that. The guide often talks about biblical interpretations and says, yes, yes, but, yes, yes, and. Not that the Bible is inherently wrong. However, the language with which it describes things was meant for another time. It was meant for a time that was more oral than written, that was not intended to be put under the magnifying glass of academic scrutiny. And it was, and this is my primary point, it was aimed at a specific audience in a specific time period of human civilization, so that the concept may be multifaceted, but this civilization might only accept 1 or 2 explanations. And therefore, religious writings may have been forced to meet the limitations of not only the individual human mind, but the ability of culture to absorb. So fast forward, and today we're looking at trying to eliminate racism, trying to find equality. That's not part of ancient civilization. As in the Declaration of Independence, it says, we the people, freedom for all, didn't intend it to mean all walking human beings. Meant it to mean who was accepted as being a free person, who was accepted as having earned liberty, and invisibly excluding women for voting and other races and other classes that didn't own property. So even as recent as a few hundred years ago, you can't use that language and say they wanted it to be all, but they weren't able to pull it off. Some of them didn't want it to be all. They were writing metaphorically, poetically. The Bible does a lot of that, as does other religious literature. If, for instance, we now know a great deal because of our new telescopes, which I'm fixated on, because it keeps destroying theories. I have such heartfelt, not pain, my heart goes out to astrophysicists who have to keep throwing away the rule book and rewriting it because of new information that comes to them. And then they have to figure out how that all fits in. How would you explain the current reality as we know it to someone who was still finding Copernicus's theory that the Earth rotates around the sun rather than the sun rotating around the Earth? They still found that challenging. And institutions themselves were banning it as heretical. There's a time and place for such knowledge, and it's a process. That's how I understand the guide's explanations. He's doing the best he can. That's an oft-repeated phrase. I'm doing the best I can. And so it is, at one point, the guide says, you have 4, 5, 6 dimensions. We have dozens, hundreds. How do we explain our world to you when we have to explain it within the dimensional context that you can comprehend? Here's a really good example. In Patrick Lecture 112, the guide on time, the guide says time doesn't exist in spirit. Spend a little while contemplating that. What if there is no time and everything exists at once? That's not our reality. This would include the possibility that different realities exist all at once. that every time a decision is made, it splinters. This is a science fiction trope. Every time a decision is made, it creates an alternate universe and then another alternate universe. And spiritually, there's room for all of this, that we can learn 20 different things at once. But our human consciousness is probably only going to be able to handle one or two. These are the metaphors I use to encourage people who read these early lectures in specific, who that are very detailed in terms of metaphysical realities, where the guide simply says, this is the truth. There are other places in the lectures where the guide says, this is true, and it's not my reality. And I just have some level of faith that it may be true. And if I can't grok it, maybe it's not meant for me to work with right now. I don't have to understand everything. So the conflicts that I have, I put them aside. There's plenty more to work on, especially since the guide transitioned, give or take, Patrick Lecture 24, from explaining the universe and the how to the why. Now, that's another place for metaphor, because when you try to explain the cosmic stuff, that we are here to manifest our false beliefs, misconceptions, and distortions, act them out, and see the pain and suffering they cause so that we will not believe in them anymore, not hold them, not be attached to them. That's very abstract. So I'm going to give the example of a children's book that I loved. Actually was written in 1947 or so, called Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. And this was the original nanny will teach the child when the parents are frustrated, a series of books. And her philosophy, in my interpretation, was to allow the child to follow through on its desires, its urges, its autonomy, to their logical absurdity, within bounds, with care, if the child wasn't hurt, but that the child was able to, for instance, say, I won't clean my room. And in the book or the chapter on that, the result is the kid can't find anything in their room. And they wind up sleeping on Lego blocks and waking up in the morning with red marks. And it's frustrating. And it's hard for mom to let this happen. So Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is the stand-in for allow this to develop until the child themselves begins to see the wisdom of at least occasional cleanups. Now, most of you have had such an experience of letting things go too far until you couldn't tolerate the consequences, and therefore you backed up and changed your behavior, outlook, opinion. That's a metaphor for why we're here, and we are given a lot of latitude. It is hard to believe that when we see pain and suffering that we can feel, see, and hear, when it feels all too real to us. It is difficult to imagine that this is an illusion meant to help us see something. But that is similar to a lot of the other things that the guide is teaching, in that time, Patrick Lecture 112, time doesn't exist, and yet we're ruled by it. Pathwork for me is a way of trying to find a little distance between the illusion and the possible truth, so that I obey time. I have to. I obey gravity. I obey time. And I try to understand it. But I don't understand it as a life-death duality ruling me. I try to understand it from a gentle perspective of it's a useful tool that allows me to live in a material playground. I hope this makes sense. This last section is really interesting, as are the first between 15 and 20 lectures. So I hope you take a look at them. Thanks for listening, and take care.